Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Simon, for the introduction. John, hopefully you can put my slides up now. So what I'm going to be talking about this morning is flooding and the impact of climate change on flooding. And we are a small unit based in Bristol that develop global climate models based around flooding. So thank you. Next slide, please. So what do we know about flooding? Well, all flooding is local. It's very spatially dependent, which means that it can vary over very short distances. But how do we understand flooding with a changing climate? So what we need to do is establish how climate change is going to transform flood risk going forward. If we have a good understanding today, how do we take that into the future? Next slide, please. So this really gives you an indication. So next slide, please, John. Okay, so when we're talking about the impact of climate change on flooding, suffice to say it's quite complicated and there are lots of moving parts. I'm not going to go into any great detail here, obviously, but essentially we have two key elements here. Firstly, due to greenhouse emissions, we are looking at pluvial flooding, essentially flash flooding and river flooding. With a warmer atmosphere, more moisture can be held in that atmosphere, resulting in larger rainfall, extreme rainfall events, and flash flooding. And then once that flooding then moves from the pooling into the natural river channels and flows into rivers. On the coastal side, with the increasing temperatures, we've got the oceans are warming, they're expanding. And so they're getting bigger. The ice is melting, increasing sea level rise, combined with the thermal expansion, which is going to elicit more coastal flooding. Next slide, please. So how do we essentially adapt and understand the impact of climate on flooding? Well, one of the key ways is really to use models to predict this future change. And it's not just one model. We use a whole range of climate ensembles, particularly for the UK. We're using UK CP18, working with the Met Office as part of the derivation of that. But from those regional climate models, we need to understand the impact of extreme rainfall, hydrological river flow, and ocean to determine the different types of flooding. Now, climate models are very good at predicting climate. They're not very good, and they don't predict the weather. So we have to make certain assumptions in our modeling to understand the impact in climate and resulting in those changes in flooding. Next slide, please. So we've been doing a lot of research on the impact of climate change on flooding in the UK, and we'll be publishing a seminal paper next month on the 7th. In fact, we've got the BBC in here today filming for the launch of that. But that scientific paper is very much around the impact of climate change and flooding in the UK. We can see from this snapshot, here's typically how extreme rainfall events are going to occur between now and 2070 in a RCP 8.5, which is a high scenario, high global warming scenario. And we can see there are quite significant changes, particularly in the coastal areas. The west coast, there's going to be less rainfall, and on the east coast, there's going to be increased rainfall. So ultimately, what does that mean? Next slide, please. Well, we can see here in this next slide that the actual impact on flooding is not going to be the same everywhere, and it's not going to be the same across all the sub-mechanisms of flooding. We can see that the fluvial or river flooding is actually going to increase at a nominal rate. The flash flooding, as you can imagine, is going to increase, but by far the most significant increase is going to be in coastal flooding. And we can see here on some of the maps that we've derived where those areas are going to be impacted, and particularly on the coastal flooding, no surprise in looking at the east coast, but there's a significant amount of flooding in the southwest and South Wales that traditionally hasn't been identified as flood risk in these areas. But by understanding the flood risk, we can also understand loss and the average annual loss, and calculate the impact of flooding in terms of the economy. And that really takes us on to the next stage. Next slide, please. In understanding the impact of flooding in different areas. So here's a typical flood example. This is for 2050 in Humber. You can see there's significant inundation of the flood extent, overtopping of the existing flood defences. So how do we put that into context? Next slide, please. Well, there are a number of scenarios and use cases here, whether that's using it for site selection for new sites or understand the existing sites. For linear assets, it's looking for essentially the wet spots across a whole network, whether that's transportation or energy infrastructure. It's then looking at the key components when we're looking at critical infrastructure, whether that be airports or roads. And then I'll talk a little bit about climate analytics. Next slide, please. So when we're talking about critical assets, essentially this is looking at the key points and the nature of flooding on those, not just today, but also the state and the operational lifetime of that asset. And so it's important that we have a good understanding of the impact of flooding for those critical infrastructure. And this is what we're doing, next slide, with the Credo project, where our data is underpinning the modeling that we're doing excuse me, for the Credo project, both understanding climate change today, but also in the future. Okay, that's me. Well, just one last slide. Sorry, this slide I've flicked across. By understanding the impact of climate change, what we're able to do is adapt that and have different perspectives. Different assets and different asset classes will require a number of different climate scenarios going forward, both on a time horizon, but under different climate change scenarios. So through the climate analytics framework, we can derive climate condition flood maps, both in the UK and globally, but that's essentially that can be overlaid over the infrastructure to identify the critical pinch points and the interconnectivity between critical assets. And this, again, is the work that we're looking to do through the Credo project. So hopefully I'm pretty close to time there. And thank you for your attention.